On the 2nd of November, 2021, a British newspaper told its readers that the Royal Marines had just done something no headline had dared claim in living memory. In a 5-day battle fought across the California desert, a single commando unit had not merely held its own against the United States Marine Corps. It had, the report said, dominated them. It had reduced nearly every American asset on the scoreboard to a confirmed kill. It had forced the most powerful amphibious force on Earth to ask for the fight to be stopped and reset halfway through, because the Americans could see no way to win. A humiliating surrender, the story called it. Within 72 hours, the United States Marine Corps would answer with a flat denial, insisting not only that it had not happened, but that it could not have happened. Tell me in the comments, when two of the closest allies on Earth meet in the same desert, who walks out claiming victory? Now let's go. The report carried the byline of Dominic Nichols, the defense correspondent of the Daily Telegraph, and it arrived with a confidence that left little room for doubt. 40 Commando, the Taunton-based unit at the heart of a newly assembled British task group, had been pitted against an American adversary at the United States Marine Corps' enormous training range in Southern California. According to the Telegraph, the British had eliminated nearly the whole of the opposing American force within the first days of the exercise. The kill board, the running tally that exercise staff used to record which vehicles and weapons and command posts have been knocked out of the fight, had a mark against almost every American asset on it. Faced with that, the report said, the Americans had asked for the simulated battle to be reset so they could carry on. The word the paper chose for what had happened to the United States Marines was surrender. The story did not stay in one newspaper for long. It was picked up, rewritten, and republished across the British press and then across the world, each retelling carrying the same essential shape and the same triumphant adjectives. Royal Marines dominate. Americans humiliated. The smaller, older, perpetually underfunded British force had walked into the home of the largest expeditionary military on Earth and beaten them at their own game. On social media, the reaction was immediate and predictable, a wave of national pride on one side of the Atlantic and a rising irritation on the other. The story asks nothing of the reader except agreement, and a great many readers were happy to agree. What almost none of them knew, scrolling past the headline that morning, was that the central claim was already being taken apart by the very force it described, and that the truth of what had happened in that desert was both less tidy and far more interesting than the word surrender could ever capture. To understand why, you have to start not in California, but with a British fighting force that had spent the better part of a decade fighting for its own survival. The Royal Marines did not need a victory in California for the reasons most observers would assume. They are among the most respected light infantry on the planet, a force whose commando training is studied and envied across Allied militaries, and their professional reputation has never seriously been in question. What had been in question, repeatedly and publicly, was whether the British government intended to keep paying for them. For more than a decade, the Ministry of Defense had moved through a near-continuous cycle of reviews, each one searching for savings, each one casting a cold eye over capabilities that were expensive to maintain and difficult to justify in an age of tightening budgets. Amphibious warfare sat permanently near the top of that list. The specialized ships, the landing craft, the helicopters, the sheer logistical weight of putting men ashore from the sea, all of it cost a great deal of money. And in review after review, the suggestion surfaced that Britain might no longer be able to afford the way of war the Royal Marines existed to practice. The pattern went back years before anyone had heard of Green Dagger. The Strategic Defense and Security Review of 2010 drawn up in the shadow of a financial crisis, had taken a blade to the British Armed Forces, retiring aircraft and ships and tens of thousands of personnel across all three services. The Royal Marines survived that round, but the experience taught the Corps a lesson it would not forget, which was that no reputation, however glittering, was a guarantee of safety when the Treasury went looking for money. Then, in 2017, the threat became specific and personal. Reports emerged that the Ministry of Defense was considering scrapping the Royal Navy's 2 amphibious assault ships, the vessels purpose-built to carry Royal Marines and their landing craft into action, and cutting the strength of the Corps itself by a substantial number of men. For a force whose entire identity rested on the ability to come from the sea, losing the ships that carried them was close to an existential wound. The proposals provoked a public outcry and a campaign to save the ships, and they were eventually shelved. But the message had been delivered with total clarity. The Royal Marines were not untouchable. They were, in the cold arithmetic of a defense review, a line item like any other, and lines could be cut. To understand why this cut so deep, you have to understand what amphibious warfare means to the British, and for that you have to go back to the spring of 1982. When Argentine forces seized the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic, it was the Royal Marines, who formed the spearhead of the task force, sent 8,000 miles to take them back. Marines of 3 Commando Brigade landed at San Carlos Water under the threat of air attack, established a beachhead on hostile ground, and then crossed the bleak and frozen terrain of East Falkland on foot, carrying enormous loads across the peat and the rock in the punishing march that the Marines themselves called yomping. They fought through the mountains that ringed the capital, and they took them, one ridge at a time, in some of the hardest small unit fighting the British Army had seen since the Second World War. The Falklands Campaign was the proof, written in blood and endurance, that the ability to project force from the sea and put trained commandos ashore against a defended coast was not a relic of a vanished age, but a capability that could still decide the fate of a war. That memory, more than any budget line, was what the Royal Marines carried into every defense review that followed. To cut the amphibious force was, in the eyes of those who revered that history, to forget the lesson the Falklands had taught at such cost. By 2021, the pressure had sharpened into something close to an existential question once again. The government's Integrated Review of Defense and Foreign Policy, published that year, set out a vision of a smaller, more technologically sophisticated military, and within that vision, every traditional capability was expected to prove that it still earned its place. The Defense Secretary at the time, Ben Wallace, framed the choice in language that left no ambiguity. He warned against the temptation, as he put it, to use the shield of sentimentality to protect capabilities that had once won wars but might no longer be fit for the next one. To cling to the past out of affection, in other words, was to risk the lives of the people sent to fight with outdated tools. The argument was reasonable, and it was also a warning shot, and the institutions on the receiving end of it understood exactly what it meant. A force that could not demonstrate its relevance was a force that might not survive the next round of cuts. For the Royal Marines, a visible, dramatic, headline-friendly success against the most capable Marines in the world was not merely good publicity. It was an argument made in the only currency that defense reviews respect, which is proven capability. The exercise in the Mojave was a test of soldiering, and also, whether anyone said so aloud, a fight for the future of the Corps itself. And the unit chosen to carry that argument into the desert came from one of the oldest fighting traditions in the British order of battle. 40 Commando, Royal Marines, is based at Norton Manor Camp near Taunton in the west of England, and its lineage runs back through some of the hardest fighting of the last 80 years. commandos of the Royal Marines earned their reputation in the Second World War as raiding troops, men trained to land where they were not expected and to strike with a speed and aggression that conventional infantry could not match, and that founding identity has never left them. In the decades since, the unit had served almost everywhere the British Army had been sent, from the long and grinding security campaign in Northern Ireland to the deserts of Iraq. Most recently, it had deployed repeatedly to Afghanistan, including tours in Helmand Province, the same unforgiving country where so much of the modern British Army learned its hardest lessons, and it had taken casualties there in the kind of sustained, close-quarter combat that leaves a battalion with few illusions about what war actually involves. The men who deployed to California in 2021 were the inheritors of that record. At the core of the British contingent was Charlie Company of 40 Commando, supported by specialists from across the wider Commando Brigade, including the Armored Support Group's 3 Troop, who brought with them the Viking, a tracked, articulated all-terrain vehicle built to carry Marines across ground that would stop most other machines. They were not a large force. That was, in a sense, the entire point. Their opponents were anything but small. The exercise was hosted and run by the United States Marine Corps, and the adversary the British faced was built around American units, including the 2nd Battalion of the 5th Marines and elements of the 7th Marines, formed up into what the exercise designers call a pure force, a concentrated body of Marines whose job was to attack and to test the defenders to their limit. These were not second-rate troops playing the role of an enemy for someone else's benefit. They were frontline American infantry, well-equipped and well-led, operating on their own ground, and inside an exercise their own corps had designed. And here lies the first fact that the triumphant headlines either missed or chose to ignore. The contest was not Britain against America. The Royal Marines did not fight alone against the United States Marine Corps. They fought as the lead element of a multinational allied team that also drew in forces from Canada, the Netherlands, and the United Arab Emirates. And that team itself included American Marines fighting alongside the British against the American adversary force. The line in this battle did not run neatly between 2 flags. It ran between 2 sides, each of them mixed, in an exercise whose whole purpose was for allies to learn to fight as one. That the sides were blended is the first reason the simplest version of the story cannot be true. It is far from the last. And to see the rest, you have to understand what 40 Commando had actually been sent to California to prove. The idea being tested in the desert was that smaller could mean deadlier. For several years, the Royal Navy and the Royal Marines had been developing a concept they called the Future Commando Force, an attempt to reinvent the way British Marines fought so that they would matter in a world of long-range missiles, persistent surveillance, and contested coastlines, where massing large numbers of men in one place had become a way to get them killed. The driving force behind the reform was the head of the Royal Navy at the time, the First Sea Lord, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, who envisaged commandos who were lighter, more dispersed, more mobile, and far more closely tied to modern sensors and communications than the amphibious assault troops of earlier generations. Rather than storming a beach in overwhelming strength, the new commando would slip ashore in small teams, strike at points of real value, and vanish before an enemy could bring its firepower to bear. In many ways, the new concept was a deliberate return to the original raiding spirit of the wartime commandos, refitted for an age of satellites and precision weapons. What that meant in practice was a wholesale change in how the Royal Marines equipped, organized, and thought about themselves. The old model, built around large-scale amphibious landings of the kind the Falklands had demanded, was giving way to something closer to a special operations-capable force, designed to be forward-deployed and constantly present in the world's tense maritime regions rather than held at home waiting for a war to begin. The Marines were being issued new weapons and new uniforms, trained to operate in small autonomous teams, and pushed to integrate uncrewed systems, the surveillance drones and other unmanned tools that were rapidly reshaping the modern battlefield into the way they fought. The reform was not happening in isolation either. Across the Atlantic, the United States Marine Corps was undergoing its own painful reinvention, shedding tanks and heavy artillery in favor of a leaner, more distributed force designed to fight inside the range of a peer enemy's missiles in the vast spaces of the Pacific. Two of the world's most storied Marine forces were, at the very same moment, trying to answer the same difficult question about what amphibious troops were even for in the 21st century, and the exercise in the Mojave was, among other things, a chance for each to measure its answer against the other. To put the concept into practice, the Royal Navy created two new formations called littoral response groups, the word littoral meaning the contested zone where the sea meets the land, the narrow margin that has always been the most dangerous ground in amphibious war. One of them, the Northern Group, was oriented toward Europe and the Baltic, ready to react to events along NATO's exposed northern and eastern flanks. The other, the Southern Group, was built around Future Commando and intended to operate far from home, east of the Suez Canal, with a planned base around the port of Duqm in Oman and an eye toward the Indian Ocean and the wider Indo-Pacific. The exercise in the Mojave was the capstone test of that Southern Group's commando element, the moment when months of theory and training would be measured against a real, thinking, capable opponent. And the stakes ran in both directions. A clear success would prove that the new way of fighting worked, that a small, agile commando force really could deliver what its planners promised. A visible, undeniable failure, played out in front of Allied observers and recorded on an American killboard, would have handed the concept's critics exactly the evidence they needed to argue that the whole expensive reinvention had been a mistake. The place chosen to measure all of this was not subtle. The Marine Corps Air-Ground Combat Center at Twentynine Palms in the high desert of Southern California is large enough to lose a country in. Spread across the Mojave, it covers an area often compared in size to the whole of Luxembourg, more than 3,500 square kilometers of mountain, valley, and open desert. And it exists for a single purpose, which is to let the Marine Corps fight realistic battles at full scale before its units deploy for real. It ranks among the largest military training areas on Earth, and the exercise the British had come to take part in, known as Green Dagger, is run there every year. Green Dagger is a 5-day, force-on-force event, a multinational gathering in which American Marines and the forces of allied nations test themselves against a dedicated adversary, and in 2021, it served as a lead-in to a still larger American warfighting exercise scheduled for later that same October. Much of the fighting centered on 3 built-up areas constructed specifically for this kind of training. The largest of them, a sprawling artificial town of around 1,200 buildings, a place purpose-built so that soldiers could practice the brutal, disorienting business of urban combat without leaving the desert. The range had spent decades earning its fearsome reputation. American Marines have long spoken of Twentynine Palms with a mixture of dread and respect, the place where units are broken down and rebuilt under conditions as close to real combat as a training environment can make them, where the heat and the dust and the sheer scale of the ground wear a force down before the enemy ever appears. Generations of Marines had passed through it on their way to Iraq and Afghanistan, and the lessons learned in its valleys had been paid for in the realism that the staff there guarded jealously. To bring a foreign force into that environment and hand it a central role was a genuine mark of trust, and to perform well, there was a genuine achievement, because the range did not hand out easy days to anyone. To understand the argument that would later erupt over what happened there, you have to understand how a battle like this is actually fought, because it is not fought with live rounds aimed at living men. The weapons fire blanks and training ammunition, and many of the soldiers and vehicles carry laser-based systems that register a hit when an opponent takes aim and fires, so that a man who has been shot or a vehicle that has been struck knows it at once and is counted out of the fight. The heavier killing power, the artillery and the airstrikes that in a real war would level buildings, is represented by simulators and by the rulings of the exercise staff who control the event. Hits are adjudicated rather than inflicted. Observer controllers move through the battlefield as impartial referees, watching what each side does, judging the outcome of engagements, and feeding the results into the running tally that exercise staff keep of who has lost what. When a vehicle or a position is judged to have been destroyed, it goes on to that tally, the kill board, as a loss. Nobody actually dies. There were no casualties in this battle in any literal sense. No wounded, no funerals, none of the permanent arithmetic of real combat. And that single fact sits at the heart of everything that followed. Because in an exercise, the staff also have the power to do something that no real battlefield permits. When one side has gained such an overwhelming advantage that continuing would simply waste the remaining days. The controllers can reset the situation, regenerate the units that have been knocked out, and send everyone back into the fight so that the planned training objectives can still be met. A reset is not a white flag, but a tool of instruction, built into the design of the exercise precisely so that a lopsided early result does not bring 5 days of expensive training to a premature halt. The distinction sounds technical. That distinction is, in fact, the whole story. Destroyed and surrendered are not the same word, and the gap between them is where a training success would be turned into an international incident. The purpose of the whole machine, the lasers and the referees and the resets and the kill board, was never to produce a winner. It was to wear two forces against each other hard enough and realistically enough that both walked away better than they had arrived, and to measure, as honestly as a simulation can, what worked and what did not. Both sides arrived with a plan. The Allied team, with 40 Commando at its core, was assigned in large part to the defense, tasked with holding the built-up areas against an American force whose job was to take them. The American pure force, concentrated and aggressive, intended to do exactly that, to mass its strength, push into the defended ground, and overwhelm the Allied positions through weight and tempo. The British, true to the concept they had come to prove, did not intend to meet that weight head-on. Their plan leaned on mobility, on dispersion, on striking at the enemy's flanks and rear rather than trading blow for blow along a fixed line, the disproportional effect that the new commando doctrine promised. Beyond those broad outlines, much of the fine detail of the exercise has never been made public. The precise day-by-day objectives were not published, and even the dates were reported inconsistently afterward, with official photographs spanning late September and into October, while one American statement placed the 5-day battle at the very end of October, a confusion that tells you something about how loosely the public account of this event was ever pinned down. What is clear is the shape of what unfolded once the fighting began, and at the start, it went very much the way the British had hoped. The Allied force, by the account of the Royal Navy itself, won decisive battles early. In the opening phase of the exercise, the team led by 40 Commando seized the initiative and took ground from the American adversary, and at some point in those early days, the Allied side achieved the result that would later become legend. A former United States Marine with contacts at Twentynine Palms, George Hasseltine, described what happened in plain terms, saying that the Allied and American team had isolated and destroyed the opposing American pure force. That is the grain of truth at the center of everything. The defenders did, in one phase of the exercise, comprehensively defeat the attacking force arrayed against them. On the back of that success, the kill board filled with marks against the American assets, and it was the state of that board, more than anything else, that the Telegraph would later seize upon. What happened next is where the accounts diverge. Hasseltine's explanation was straightforward and entirely undramatic. Having destroyed the adversary so thoroughly, he suggested, it would have been a waste to simply stop with most of the scheduled exercise still to run, and so the units were regenerated and the fight continued through the planned days. Not a surrender. A reset of exactly the kind these exercises are built to perform. The battle did not end with that early Allied success, and the days that followed were not a victory parade. As the exercise wore on and the regenerated American force pressed back into the contested ground, the Royal Marines did what the new concept demanded of them, mounting raids behind the enemy's lines to disrupt the counterattacks before they could gather momentum, refusing to be drawn into the kind of static slugging match in which superior numbers would tell. This was the whole theory of the Future Commando Force made flesh, a smaller force using speed and surprise to unbalance a larger one, striking where it was not expected, and slipping away before the weight of the response could land. The defense held its shape. When the exercise reached its final phase, the American adversary launched a last assault on the Allied positions, a concentrated push to break through in the closing hours, and it was repelled. By the time the controllers called an end to the 5 days, the Allied force led by 40 Commando held more than 2/3 of the contested battlefield. By any reasonable measure, that is a genuine, impressive result. A small multinational force built around a single British commando unit holding most of the ground against a determined American opponent on that opponent's own training range. This was the validation the Future Commando Force had come looking for. It was real, and it was about to be translated by people thousands of miles from the desert into something it was not. What happened next happened nowhere near California. The first move in that translation came from the British themselves. On the 30th of October, as the exercise wound down, 40 Commando shared word of its success, framing the result as a triumph on Green Dagger, the kind of upbeat message that any proud unit puts out at the end of a hard exercise. Nothing in it was improper. The unit had performed well and said so, but that modest claim of success landed in a particular environment, and the environment did the rest. The Daily Telegraph took the story and rendered it in the vocabulary of real war. A defensive success across a multinational exercise became domination. A routine regeneration of destroyed units became a plea for mercy. The professional achievement of holding ground against a peer adversary became, in the paper's framing, a humiliating surrender by the United States Marine Corps. One American service publication later noted, with evident discomfort, that the original British report carried a tone unusually breathless for a serious broadsheet. The conditions for that breathlessness were not hard to find. Here was a British force, fighting under the shadow of cuts, desperate to prove its worth, and here was a story in which that force had bested the mightiest Marines in the world. It amounted, as one analysis put it, to a near-perfect storm, a tale almost engineered to travel. And travel it did, repeated and amplified, until the single word at its center, surrender, had hardened from a journalist's flourish into something that looked, to the casual reader, like an established fact. The United States Marine Corps does not, as a rule, let the word surrender stand. The American response was swift, public, and unusually direct for a matter involving a close ally. A spokesman for the Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center, Captain Zachary Colvin, addressed the claim head-on, and his rebuttal struck at the foundations of the entire story. The exercise, he explained, wasn't built to produce a winner at all. There was no mechanism in it to keep score, no procedure by which one side could surrender, and the resets that the British account had treated as evidence of American defeat were simply part of how the training worked. Winners, he said, are never determined. The purpose of the whole event was to raise the performance of every unit involved and to strengthen the core ability to fight alongside its allies, not to crown a champion. The thing the headlines described as the central, decisive moment of the battle, the American surrender, was not in the core account, a thing that the exercise was even capable of containing. There had been no surrender because there was no such option. There had been no reset born of despair because resets were routine. There had been no defeat of America by Britain because the British and a good many Americans had been fighting on the same side. The reaction inside the American military went beyond the official statement because the story had touched a nerve that ran deeper than any single exercise. To the United States Marine Corps, surrender is not a neutral word. It cuts against the most fundamental part of how the Corps understands itself, against a culture that teaches every Marine that the institution does not quit and does not yield, and the suggestion that American Marines had raised their hands to anyone, even in a simulation, even by the loose translation of a foreign newspaper, was always going to provoke a sharp response. Across American defense media, the pushback gathered quickly. Two separate pieces in one military publication dismantled the surrender narrative within days. Another respected American defense outlet laid out, carefully and without rancor, how the mechanics of the exercise had been misunderstood, explaining to its readers the very things about resets and adjudication that the original story had either missed or ignored. The criticism was not only American. Rob Lee, a widely read defense analyst, then at the Department of War Studies at King's College London, was blunt about the damage the coverage could do, describing the worst of the British write-ups as garbage and warning that this kind of reporting threatened the future of exactly the joint exercises that both nations relied upon. His point was not merely that the story was wrong on the facts, though he made clear that it was, noting again that 40 Commando had been teamed with American units rather than ranged against all of them. His deeper worry was practical. These exercises exist because allies who expect to fight together must first learn to train together, and turning every shared drill into a nationalistic scoreboard, in which one ally crows over another's manufactured humiliation, gives the participants every reason to stop inviting each other. A story written to celebrate the special relationship had, in its carelessness, taken a small bite out of it. The uncomfortable question that hung over all of it was simple. If the Americans said it had not happened, had the British lied? The truth sat in the space between the two press releases. The honest answer is that both sides were right, which is the most inconvenient kind of disagreement, because it offers no villain and no clean victory to anyone. The British claim of success was not invented. The Allied force had indeed dominated phases of the exercise, had destroyed the opposing pure force in one stretch of the fighting, and had ended the 5 days holding most of the contested ground. Strip away the inflated language, and a real and creditable achievement remains. At the same time, the American correction was equally true. The exercise really did lack any concept of winning or surrender. The resets really were a standard instructional tool rather than an admission of defeat, and the framing of Britain triumphing over America really did misrepresent a contest in which the two were substantially on the same side. The myth was not born of a lie. It was born of a mistranslation, the quiet and almost invisible act of carrying a set of facts out of the language of the training range and into the language of war, where words like dominate and surrender mean something they were never meant to mean. In a desert full of blank ammunition and adjudicated kills. Not a fabrication. A translation error with a flag wrapped around it. And there is a final irony buried in the whole affair, one that the exercise's own designers would appreciate. The entire point of running a battle this realistic, this large, this unforgiving, is to teach soldiers not to mistake a single one engagement for a one war, not to confuse the destruction of one enemy force in one phase with final victory. The story that escaped from Twentynine Palms made precisely that mistake on a global scale. The loudest version of this story got one more thing wrong, and it had nothing to do with the desert at all. There were never any Navy SEALs, and there was never a beach. The confusion is understandable because the SEALs and the beach were both perfectly real. They simply belonged to a different story. Some months earlier, in May of 2021, the other British task group, the northern group bound for Europe and the Baltic, had been exercising off the coast of Scotland. During that exercise, Royal Marines trained alongside United States Navy SEALs, the American Sea, Air, and Land Commandos, in a series of amphibious operations that saw both forces moved from ship to shore. American Osprey tiltrotor aircraft lifted British Marines and American SEALs together from British vessels, among them the assault ship that anchored the deployment, supported by a Royal Fleet auxiliary landing ship and a frigate, and put them ashore on the Scottish coast. By every account, it was a model of cooperation, and the men who organized it spoke of it that way. A Royal Navy officer who helped run the aviation side of the exercise, Lieutenant Commander Bob Powell, described the value of working with the Americans in glowing terms, and reflected that the bond between the two navies remained, in his words, as strong as it had ever been. There was no contest in Scotland. There was no winner and no loser, no kill board, no surrender. Only two Allied commando forces learning to operate from the same decks and land on the same shore. And somewhere in the retelling, on the internet, where stories lose their edges and merge into one another, the cooperative landing in Scotland and the competitive exercise in California fused together into a single false legend, one in which Royal Marines beat American Navy SEALs to a beach, and the defeated Americans were left to mutter their grudging respect. It is a satisfying story, and also an assembly of two true events into one untrue one, and the truth underneath it is in many ways better than the myth. The genuine relationship between these forces is not one of rivalry, but of a closeness that runs deep, built over decades of training and fighting side by side. A closeness that the louder, more flattering legend actually obscures. That closeness is not a sentimental abstraction. It is woven into the structure of how both forces operate. British officers serve inside American formations, and Americans inside British ones. The two Marine forces share doctrine, swap personnel, and have stood next to each other in nearly every major Western campaign of the last several decades. American Marines who have worked with the Royal Marines tend to speak of them with real admiration, praising the toughness and the dark humor and the willingness to fight that the British bring with them, and the respect runs in both directions. The whole purpose of an event like Green Dagger is to deepen exactly that bond, to make two militaries that may one day have to fight a real war together, capable of doing so as if they were one. The exercise in the Mojave succeeded in that purpose. It was only in the telling, far from the desert, that the success was dressed up as a defeat for one of the partners, and the cost of that dressing up was borne not by the newspaper that printed it, but by the very relationship the participants had spent weeks strengthening. By the time the headlines faded, the exercise had already done its actual job. That job was never to humiliate anyone. Green Dagger, in 2021, fed directly into the larger American warfighting exercise that followed it. That October, and the Southern Littoral Response Group, the formation 40 Commando had been sent to validate, moved on toward operational readiness and the role that had been planned for it east of Suez, around Oman, and out toward the Indo-Pacific. The Future Commando Force, the broader reinvention of the Royal Marines that the whole exercise had been designed to test, continued to take shape in the years that followed, refined and argued over and adjusted as any major military reform is. Measured against its real purpose, the exercise was a quiet success, the kind that produces lessons and readiness rather than headlines. And yet it is the headline that survived. The legend of the desert humiliation has long outlived the correction that followed it, living on in online retellings and forum arguments and confident captions. The story of the time the British beat the Americans, repeated by people who never saw the Marine Corps denial or the analysts' warnings or the simple structural fact that the exercise had no surrender to give. As a piece of military history, the episode barely registers. There are no memorials to a training exercise, no films, no campaign honors, because nothing was lost and nothing was won in any sense that history records. What it leaves behind instead is a lesson of a different kind. It stands as a case study in how a realistic, casualty-free training event, run by allies for the benefit of allies, can be lifted out of context and remade into a nationalistic morality tale, and in what that remaking costs the very partnerships it claims to celebrate. It serves, too, as a small, sharp data point in a much larger argument that is still unresolved, the argument over whether the kind of light, mobile, dispersed commando force that 40 Commando carried into the Mojave can really deliver an effect, out of all proportion to its size, when set against a serious, peer opponent. On the evidence of those 5 days, the answer leaned toward yes. On the evidence of the coverage that followed, the answer to a different question, about how much of what we believe about our own armies is actually true, leaned somewhere far less comfortable. The same appetite that turned a training exercise into a famous victory is the appetite that shapes a great deal of what the public thinks it knows about war, and it rarely pauses to ask whether the most repeatable version of a story is also the most accurate one. In the end, the most repeated fact about the Battle of Twentynine Palms was the one thing that could not have happened. The United States Marines did not surrender because the exercise they were fighting in contained no surrender to offer, no white flag in its rulebook, no mechanism by which one Allied force could bend the knee to another. The single detail that made the story irresistible was the single detail that was structurally impossible. What actually happened was quieter and harder to fit into a headline. A small British commando force, fighting for the future of its own existence, walked onto the largest training range in the American arsenal and proved that a new and unproven way of war could hold its ground against the best in the world. 2 of the closest allies on Earth spent a fortnight in the desert, making each other sharper and more dangerous to the people they might one day actually have to fight, which is the entire reason such exercises exist, and the only result that ever truly mattered. And a newspaper, reaching for a word that did not belong in a place without casualties or scoreboards or defeat, turned all of that into a story about humiliation that the participants spent the following week trying to take back. The distance between the story a nation tells about its soldiers and what those soldiers actually did is the distance in which the real history gets written. And it is almost always the quieter version that turns out to be true. If you think the real story deserved the louder headline, say so in the comments. And if you want to see how Britain gambled the future of its Royal Marines on a single dangerous idea, watch this next.